Is Lara a video game icon? A sex symbol?
I think she is both.
Released back when I had testosterone in 1996, Lara Croft's polygons triggered an early onset of puberty in many gamers. But she was more than just a sexualized collection of several triangles struggling against her Forever 21 tank top. She was a badass. She triumphed over mind-bending puzzles, stylishly and acrobatically traversed complex platforming challenges, all while searching for treasure and taking on wolves, centaurs, and even a T-Rex. Between the 1996 original and the 2013 reboot, she was the star of 8 major video games, 4 spin-off games, a cartoon, 50 comic books, and 2 movies starring Angelina Jolie. Anyway, other than Laura's polygon count, nothing much changed over that time. She was always portrayed as kind of a superhero. She never struggled to survive. She was never that kind of Croft. That is, until 2013.
I don't think I'm that kind of crow.
Sure you are.
This is the story of Tomb Raider 2013, one of the most significant and risky pivots in video game history. Before the 2013 reboot, Crystal Dynamics helmed the LAU trilogy, Legend, Anniversary, and Underworld. Legend was the first reimagining by the studio. The game details Lara Croft's quest for the mythical sword Excalibur, racing around the world against her former friend, Amanda Everett. She navigates linear levels, fighting enemies, and solving environmental puzzles to progress. Following the completion of Legend, Crystal Dynamics began developing Anniversary using the Legend engine. Anniversary follows Lara on her quest for the Scion of Atlantis. Production of Underworld began in 2006 following the release of Tomb Raider Legend and was developed in parallel with Anniversary. In this final game of the LAU trilogy, Lara searches for Mjolnir, an artifact key to entering the realm of Helheim, while confronting adversaries from her past. By the time Underworld released in 2008, the landscape had shifted. Naughty Dog's Uncharted had effectively rewritten the rules of the genre. And after Underworld, Crystal Dynamics realized they were staring into an abyss of irrelevance. Lara's stylized acrobatics suddenly felt two-dimensional next to Nathan Drake's cinematic, grounded approach to pulp adventure.
How does something like this happen?
To survive, Crystal Dynamics concluded they needed to strip Lara
Don't you think you've seen enough?
of her power. The earliest conceptual phase of the studio's second reboot of the franchise was internally codenamed Ascension. It explored directions that were radically different from the final product. The team drew heavy inspiration from the emotionally resonant, minimalist storytelling of Ico and the immense scale of Shadow of the Colossus, as well as the survival horror tension of Resident Evil. During this phase, the island of Yamatai was envisioned not just as a realm of high fantasy and biological horror. Far from the human cultists of the final game, early concept art and prototype footage depict a foggy, open-world environment inhabited by zombie-like creatures and supernatural behemoths that required complex, multi-stage combat strategies to defeat. Another pillar of Ascension's design was the inclusion of an AI-controlled companion used to introduce asymmetric gameplay mechanics and emotional stakes. The first iteration of this concept involved a 6-year-old girl named Izumi. Izumi's small size would allow her to crawl into tight spaces, tunnels, or vents that were inaccessible to Lara, unlocking doors or retrieving key items from the other side, fundamentally changing the puzzle design from solitary logic problems to cooperative spatial challenges. And as the story progressed, the player would discover that Izumi possessed magical abilities, specifically the power to manipulate water. This would have introduced additional environmental puzzles where Lara had to traverse a landscape actively being reshaped by her waterbender companion. However, the developers found that the constant presence of a child undermined the theme of isolation they wanted to explore. It also created a protect the escort dynamic that often frustrates players if the AI is not flawless. Also, they feared the magical elements would alienate fans of the series' grounded roots. In an attempt to salvage the mechanic while simplifying the narrative, Izumi was briefly replaced by a monkey. This iteration aimed to retain the little buddy gameplay without the complex moral implications of endangering a human child. Ultimately, both were scrapped to focus entirely on Lara's internal journey of independence and isolation. Another major feature of the Ascension prototype was horseback riding, an influence of Shadow of the Colossus. The obvious decision to cut the horse was driven by scale. A world designed for rapid traversal is vastly different from a world designed for climbing and exploration. By 2010, the high fantasy elements, the companions, and the open-world mounts were excised. The team retained the horror-themed atmosphere, with the grime, the darkness, and the visceral violence, but grounded the threat in reality. The monsters became human cultists, the magic became the shamanistic storms of Queen Himiko, and the companion became the crew of the Endurance, who would be separated from Lara to ensure her isolation during gameplay. The project was rebooted from Ascension to a survivor origin story, forging Lara into a hero rather than her starting as one. I'm going to keep story details relatively light here. This is a game you should experience fresh if you haven't, but let me set the stage. 21-year-old Lara Croft is aboard the research vessel Endurance, searching for the lost kingdom of Yamatai based on research from her late father. When the ship is caught in a violent storm and torn apart, Lara washes ashore on a mysterious island populated by a violent cult called the Solari Brotherhood. What follows is an origin story in the truest sense. This isn't the confident, quippy lass of previous installments.
From this moment, your every breath is a gift from me.
This is a frightened archaeology graduate thrown into a living nightmare, forced to kill for the first time, forced to confront horrors both human and supernatural. The game's opening quote sets the tone.
The extraordinary is in what we do, not who we are.
Which, BT dubs, is actually a synthesis of two quotes, one from Sir Edmund Hillary, the other from poet George Meredith, but it captures the thesis perfectly. Lara doesn't start as a hero, she becomes one. The gameplay of the reboot was built around three pillars: combat, traversal, and scavenging. The combat system was modernized to align with the third-person cover shooters of the time. However, unlike Gears of War, Tomb Raider utilized a soft cover system where Lara would automatically crouch and take cover when near a wall. The bow was introduced as Lara's signature weapon, which actually served a dual purpose: a silent weapon for stealth kills and a tool for solving environmental puzzles. The Instinct mode, which highlighted interactive objects in the world, was added to assist modern players, though hardcore fans often criticized it for simplifying exploration. QuickTime events were heavily utilized, particularly in cinematic sequences. Failure resulted in wonderfully gruesome fail states if a player missed a button prompt during a slide or a struggle, for example. While intended to heighten the stakes, some of the daintier critics felt these deaths bordered on torture porn, reveling a bit too much in the various depictions of Lara's demise. The game eschewed the strictly linear levels of Tomb Raider Legend in favor of a hub-and-spoke design. Large areas like the Mountain Village, Shantytown, and Shipwreck Beach functioned as open exploration zones. These hubs were often connected by those linear and often claustrophobic traversal paths that masked the loading of the next area. This system allowed for a semi-open world feel while maintaining the curated pacing of a linear narrative. It heavily utilized gear gating, where certain paths in a hub were blocked until Lara acquired a specific tool, such as the climbing axe or the rope arrow. This encouraged players to revisit previous hubs, adding replay value and a sense of mastery over the environment. And for the first time in the main series, RPG elements were introduced. Players earned experience points for kills and exploration, which could be spent on skills like faster climbing or the ability to carry more ammo. Salvage collected from crates and enemies allowed for weapon upgrades. This system provided a constant dopamine loop of progression, encouraging players to hunt for collectibles like GPS caches and relics. In a move widely interpreted as a corporate mandate from Square Enix to combat the evils of the used game market and extend player retention, Tomb Raider included a competitive multiplayer mode. This component was not developed by Crystal Dynamics but was outsourced to the developers of Deus Ex: Human Revolution, Eidos Montreal. Utilizing the same traversal mechanics of the single-player game, multiplayer featured modes like Rescue, where survivors collected medical supplies while scavengers tried to stop them, and a standard team deathmatch. And it was a critical flop, The mechanics of a survival-focused, softcover-based shooter did not translate well to the frenetic pace of competitive multiplayer, and balancing issues, lag, and a lack of depth meant the community dwindled rapidly. So, while the sequels had some co-op features, competitive multiplayer was dropped for the rest of the trilogy. The narrative ambition of the reboot was to humanize a character who had effectively become a caricature. To achieve this, Crystal Dynamics hired lead writer Rhianna Pratchett. If that name sounds familiar, her father, Terry Pratchett, penned the 41-book Discworld series and co-authored Good Omens with Neil Gaiman. Rhianna Pratchett's background writing for the games Heavenly Sword and Mirror's Edge suggested her capability for handling strong, complex female protagonists. Pratchett and the narrative team operated under the guiding principle that action equals character.
Mechanics do tell you something about the character, but it's not necessarily what the story is telling you about the character. So trying to get those aligned, so having narrative people early on when you're coming up with those mechanics and when you're coming up with the basis of the world can be very useful.
In previous generations of games, a significant disconnect existed between Lara as the narrative protagonist, heroic, witty, and morally uncomplicated, and the gameplay protagonist, a mass murderer of humans and several pesky endangered species. Pratchett aimed to bridge this gap by making the act of survival the primary narrative engine. The writing process began with metascripts and extensive biographies for the entire crew of the Endurance. This preparation was intended to establish a logical world where character motivations were clear before the first line was written. Pratchett emphasized that logic is more important than realism, arguing that even if a story is utterly fantastic, the internal consistency of the world and characters must remain unbreakable. And so the goal was to depict Lara's violent and vulnerable first steps toward the heroic icon we now know.
She was quite young, she was only 21, it was a perfect expedition. I could kind of play with the naivety that you have in at that age and how that you feel like, you know what the world is like. And then you kind of get into the world and it's very different. The idea of her being massively out of her depth and actually having to rise to the challenge.
Pratchett was not shy in noting the difficulty of this task, describing the industry's, quote, low narrative literacy, and the challenge of integrating a sophisticated character arc into a game that still required the mechanics of a third-person shooter. Despite the narrative team's efforts, the 2013 reboot became a primary case study for something called ludonarrative dissonance, the conflict between the story being told and the gameplay being enacted. The narrative arc presents Lara as a traumatized, inexperienced academic. The sequence of her first kill is staged with immense gravity. After the struggle with the scavenger, Lara is visibly shook. The player is meant to feel the weight of taking a human life. However, just a few moments later, Lara engages in open combat with large groups of Solari cultists. And within an hour, Lara, the traumatized survivor, is performing headshots with a bow and braining enemies with a climbing axe. Critics noted the jarring transition from crying over a deer to mass slaughter, arguing that the gameplay loop undermined the character work done in the cutscenes. This dissonance was partly a result of the segregated development process typical of AAA games, where combat design and narrative design often occur in parallel silos.
It's like writing a movie when the movie is being shot at the same time.
While Pratchett wrote Lara as a reluctant killer, the level designers built arenas of violent combat to maintain pacing and engagement. This disconnect remains one of the most discussed aspects of the game's legacy. Skinning and murder aside, I found a detail in my research that was particularly moving. The game leans heavily on Lara's relationship with father figures, both her biological father Richard Croft and her surrogate father Conrad Roth. Pratchett found a way to make this personal by weaving her own memories of her father, Terry Pratchett, into the script. Lending some collectibles a layer of true authenticity, the in-game letters from Richard Croft about Lara were heavily inspired by Terry's memories of Rhianna. Another of many notable creatives on the project was senior art director Brian Horton, who led the visual reinvention of Tomb Raider and Lara Croft. The mandate was to move away from the stylized comic book aesthetic of previous entries and take several strides toward filmic realism. And the 2013 Lara Croft model was quite the radical departure from her predecessors. The earlier but older and more hardened Lara likely had a little work done. The clear lack of several ribs above the waist, and the obvious addition of significant weight above that, was normalized for the reboot to reflect an athletic but more human physique. Her iconic short shorts and tank top were replaced with more practical and wilderness-friendly cargo trousers and layered top. Horton also implemented a visual system of accumulated damage. At the start of the game, Lara is clean, and her clothes are relatively pristine. As the game progresses, to reinforce the survival theme, her tank top tears, but not in a good 80s kind of way, and she becomes caked in mud, blood, and makeshift bandages. This visual degradation was a constant reminder of her struggle. For nearly 17 years prior, the character of Lara Croft was defined by a specific set of traits: invulnerability, acrobatic prowess, and an aristocratic detachment from the dangers she faced. This identity was reinforced by a musical legacy established by composers such as Nathan McCree, Peter Connolly, and Troels Folman. A legacy built on soaring oboe melodies, symphonic fanfares, and a sense of wonder that evoked the romanticism of 19th century archaeology. However, the mandate for the 2013 reboot was stark and uncompromising. Start from scratch. The developers sought to tell a gritty origin story, stripping Lara of her superhero status and presenting her as a terrified, untested survivor. This narrative pivot required an auditory landscape that was antithetical to the polished symphonies of the past. It demanded a score that was visceral, textured, and psychologically grounding. The responsibility for this sonic reinvention was placed upon the shoulders of American composer Jason Graves.
There have been many composers in the games or the films, but they've always used the original theme. They said, we want to start with a clean slate, a new theme.
I always do my themes on piano because it seems to be just the most simple form of music. And I usually do them in a you could almost play it with your index fingers, very simple. And it just so happened that that general approach worked out really well for the idea of Lara's origin story.
Known primarily for his avant-garde work in the survival horror genre, specifically the Dead Space franchise, Graves was tasked with navigating a complex creative dichotomy. He had to terrify the player with the horrors of the fictional island of Yamatai while simultaneously engendering deep empathy for a protagonist who was being broken and rebuilt before their eyes. Graves' musical identity was forged in the rigors of classical training at the USC School of Cinematic Arts. Unlike many contemporaries who transitioned from rock bands or electronic production, Graves began as a percussionist. This background is critical to analyzing his compositional voice. Percussionists view music through the lens of rhythm, attack, and timbre rather than pure melody. This perspective is evident in his reliance on texture and rhythmic drive over long-line melodic phrasing. Prior to 2013, Jason Graves had already established himself as a heavyweight in the video game industry, largely defined by his work on the Dead Space trilogy. This period serves as the crucial past that informed his selection for Tomb Raider. For Dead Space, Graves pioneered a style of non-musical scoring. He famously utilized a massive 80-piece orchestra but instructed the musicians to play against their training, bowing the bridges of violins, tapping on their instruments, I think that's called col legno if memory serves, and screaming through their mouthpieces. This created a suffocating, chaotic wall of sound designed to, quote, undermine the player and scare them to death. This work earned him 2 BAFTA awards for Best Original Score and Best Use of Audio, and branded him as an auditory master of survival horror. However, this reputation presented a challenge. When approached by Crystal Dynamics, Graves had to prove he could do more than just generate terror. While Dead Space was about external alienation and a lack of humanity, Tomb Raider was intensely human. The score needed to chart an emotional arc from vulnerability to confidence. Graves noted the contrast significantly.
Thematic building and developing themes in a score is my absolute favorite thing to do, and there's not a lot of thematic material in any of the Dead Space stuff.
Where Dead Space used 80 musicians to create an alien necromorph texture, Tomb Raider would be small and personal.
My idea from the beginning was to be as simple as possible, maybe have 4 notes total. Those 3 or 4 notes would instantly let you know which character you were thinking about.
He recognized that the standard tropes of action-adventure music, with the bombastic brass fanfares and sweeping strings, would undermine the narrative goal of a gritty reboot. If the music sounded too heroic too early, the player would not feel the danger.
And the radio tower climb, everybody on board knew that it was going to be an important moment in the game, and it was kind of the only false positive feeling that you're supposed to get, because she does what she's supposed to do, and kind of the game has been building up to this until then. But when we finally were ready to put the music in it, I did a kind of quietly trepidatious, unsure version of her climb, and we had it in 3 stages as she ascended. It got a little quieter and a little more kind of open, and I was trying to mirror kind of her altitude as she went up. And I sent it to them, and they said, yeah, maybe it needs to be a little more confident. I thought they're probably right, because it was just missing something. So I did something more confident, but the whole time I was thinking, confident, this is too confident. It's not Nathan Drake, But I sent it anyway, and they agreed immediately. And they were going to cut together kind of a version between those two, and I said, no, don't edit. Let me send a 3rd version for you. So I did something kind of in between. Something was still missing, and Alex Wilmer, who implemented most of the music, actually ended up taking the stingers that I did, the middle section of the climb, and he took the more confident part of the 3rd version, and that's towards the top, and he started it with the 3rd version beginning. I love the final result.
In an interview on the Top Score podcast, Graves explained that thematic scores often fail in the horror genre because they telegraph safety. For Tomb Raider, he had to synthesize these 2 worlds, using some of the random-sounding textural techniques of horror for the island environment, while slowly introducing more structured melodic themes for Lara as she regained her agency. This delicate balance necessitated a new sonic palette, one that could not be found in a traditional orchestra. This defining sound would come from the instrument. To create a unique sound for the island of Yamatai, Graves turned to his neighbor, Matt McConnell. McConnell's background was not in luthieri, a fancy-dancy word for instrument making, but in large-scale sculpture and industrial design. This background made him the ideal collaborator for Graves, who explicitly did not want a refined musical instrument. The goal was to create an object that physically embodied the game's setting, an island of rust, shipwrecked debris, and ancient mystery. And so, the instrument was designed to look and feel like a piece of the island itself. It was constructed from materials that resonated with the game's scavenger aesthetic. When bowed with a cello bow, it produced a high-pitched, harmonic-rich screeching sound that Graves utilized for high-tension moments. Glass bowls were suspended within the metal framework and were crucial for the spiritual or supernatural elements of the score. When struck or rubbed, they produced a ringing tone that Graves likened to Buddhist monks playing glass bells. This became the sonic signature of the island's mystery. Metal spikes and rods provided the percussive elements, cold, industrial clangs that lacked the warmth of wooden drums. In a meta-narrative twist, McConnell constructed a custom bow for playing the sculpture that was modeled directly after Lara Croft's makeshift longbow from the game. This meant that the physical action of creating the music mirrored the protagonist's primary method of survival. The use of the instrument was not a gimmick. It was foundational to the score's structure. Graves committed to using only sounds generated by the instrument for the first 15 minutes of the game, specifically the Scavenger's Den sequence. Despite the success of the 2013 score, Jason Graves did not return for the sequels. Following Tomb Raider, Graves doubled down on his reputation for creating unique sonic worlds through organic means. He went on to score Until Dawn, Still Wakes the Deep, and Far Cry Primal, where he created a prehistoric orchestra using rocks, bushes, clay pots, and Aztec death whistles. While the franchise eventually pivoted back towards cinematic blockbuster aesthetics in later entries, the 2013 soundtrack remains a singular achievement. A raw, industrial, and deeply human symphony that redefined what it means to be a survivor. The search for the new Lara Croft was an exhaustive global talent hunt, reflecting the immense pressure on Crystal Dynamics to revitalize a brand that had arguably lost its way. The shift in creative direction necessitated a wholesale replacement of the voice cast and a transition from a traditional voiceover to full performance capture. The studio sought an actress who could portray a youthful, inexperienced Lara, a 21-year-old archaeology graduate thrust into a nightmare, rather than the action hero of previous iterations. The role required a British actress capable of conveying terror, pain, and eventual hardening. In June 2012, it was confirmed that Camilla Luddington had secured the role.
Camilla brings truth. She is truly breathing life into Lara Croft. And when Lara is supposed to be going through an emotional scene, you'll see tears streaming down Camilla's face, and it's real.
People ran over to her, like, are you okay? Like, she's got mascara running and tears streaming down her cheeks, and she's like, oh yeah. And you're like, wow.
She was largely known at the time for her television work, including her role as Kate Middleton in the Lifetime movie William and Kate, and a recurring arc as Lizzie in Californication. She has also portrayed Dr. Joe Wilson in Grey's Anatomy.
I love you too.
And the fairy Claudette in True Blood. The hallmark of Luddington's performance was the physical and vocal endurance required to portray Lara's suffering.
I spent a day in the ADR booth, which is where you record like a lot of the voiceover work, just dying. Just every way possible.
So they make you do the vocal sounds of dying. So what does the director say? The director says...
Okay, this is the thing about Tomb Raider. She can be killed in any way possible. So they'll be like, okay, just your face is on fire and you've been stabbed 1,000 times, make that noise. And you're like, what?
The game is infamous for its brutal and graphic fail states. She noted that directors would instruct her to die in every way possible. One specific challenge Luddington highlighted was the drowning scenes. To achieve authentic sounds of aspiration and choking, she would force herself to choke on water from a bottle while in the vocal booth. To simulate the hypothermia Lara experiences during the game's opening chapters, she made herself hyperventilate to induce actual physical shivering. She also holds the distinction of being the first actress to portray Lara Croft across 3 consecutive mainline games, Tomb Raider, Rise, and Shadow, providing a continuity of character that previous eras lacked.
I've come so far. I'm not turning back.
But that's where her tenure concluded. In 2024, it was announced that British actor Alex Wilton Regan, known for Cyberpunk 2077 and Dragon Age, would take over the mantle for the Legacy of Atlantis reimagining, while Hayley Atwell voiced the character in the Netflix anime series. If Lara Croft is the survivor, Jonah Mayava is the anchor.
A little bird, this isn't goodbye.
Portrayed by Earl Balin, Jonah is the cook on the ship Endurance and evolves into Lara's most loyal ally and moral compass throughout the trilogy. While other characters often view Lara as a means to an end or a liability, Jonah consistently views her as a person, grounding the narrative in human connection. Conrad Roth serves as the captain of the Endurance and a father figure to Lara.
Yeah. You've got great instincts, girl. You just have to trust them.
That's what my father used to say.
Now, there was a man that ran on instinct. For better or worse. He would have been so proud of you, Lara.
He is a former Royal Marine and a treasure hunter of the old school. Tough, pragmatic, but deeply loyal. His relationship with Lara is pivotal. He serves as the mentor whose influence ultimately challenges her to find her own footing. Their dynamic is the narrative spark that compels her to shed her dependence on others and fully assume the mantle of the Tomb Raider. The role required an actor who could command authority and project a certain world weariness. Crystal Dynamics cast Robin Atkin Downes, a titan in the voice acting industry with a resume spanning hundreds of titles including Atok Navarro, the main antagonist in the first Uncharted, and the medic in Team Fortress 2. Samantha Nishimura was voiced by Arden Cho, a Korean-American actress, singer, and model. Sam is Lara's best friend and a documentary filmmaker. In the Tomb Raider reboot, she functions primarily as the narrative driver. She is kidnapped by the Solari Brotherhood because of her lineage connecting her to the Sun Queen Himiko. Cho's performance captured the youthful optimism of Sam, which slowly erodes as the trauma of the island takes hold. Lara's motivation throughout the game is almost entirely centered on rescuing her. Post-2013, Arden Cho's career trajectory shifted heavily toward live-action television, where she achieved significant stardom, arguably becoming one of the most visible faces from the Tomb Raider cast in mainstream media. She played Kira Yukimura in the popular MTV series Teen Wolf, June in the Netflix series Avatar: The Last Airbender,
Tell me about this avatar.
and the voice of Rumi in the super unpopular animated musical film K-pop Demon Hunters. Robert Craighead voiced Father Matthias as well as Brock in God of War and Ragnarok, and Nolan North was credited for additional voices because he needs to be in literally every video game ever made. I must say I do love the irony that the man behind the voice of Nathan Drake, Tomb Raider's main video game rival, is part of this cast.
See that pole? It's like a drain pipe. Shimmy right up there like a gibbon. Jump in the windows, right foot, left foot over to that. Right up top, steal every artifact in your place. It's easy. Really.
You do know that you're not actually Nathan Drake.
You shut your mouth.
The core marketing objective for the 2013 reboot was to fundamentally alter the consumer's relationship with Lara the heroic avatar. Historically, playing as Lara Croft was a power fantasy. The player inhabited a character who was richer, smarter, and more physically capable than anyone else in the room. The new marketing strategy sought to invert this dynamic, positioning the player not as a master of the environment, but as a victim of it, struggling merely to exist. This shift was formalized in November 2010, when Square Enix filed for a trademark on the slogan, "A survivor is born." This tagline was not merely a catchphrase, but the thesis statement for the entire development and promotional cycle. It signaled to the market that the Lara Croft they knew, the dual pistol-wielding acrobat, did not exist yet. She had to be earned. The public campaign began with a press release and an exclusive cover story in Game Informer magazine in December 2010. In that first release, Daryl Gallagher, head of studio at Crystal Dynamics, explicitly instructed the press to forget everything you know about Tomb Raider, positioning the game as an origin story that would explore things that have never been done before in the franchise. A critical component of the Survivor narrative was the visual redesign of Lara Croft herself. The marketing team faced the challenge of retaining the character's iconic silhouette while shedding the hypersexualized baggage that had drawn criticism for over a decade. The new design featured pre-augmentation physical proportions and practical clothing, a direct response to the absurdly skimpy clothes of her predecessors. However, the marketing replaced sexual objectification with a focus on physical trauma. Promotional assets invariably depicted the character covered in mud, blood, and grime, often clutching a wound or shivering in the cold. This grim aesthetic was intended to dramatize the costs of survival. The visual language communicated that the environment of Yamatai was a hostile antagonist in itself. While this successfully differentiated the game from the polished, swashbuckling adventure style of competitors like Uncharted, it introduced a new tension: the fine line between humanizing a character through struggle and fetishizing their suffering. This was a tension that would erupt into a major controversy later in the campaign. As the marketing campaign ramped up towards E3 2012, the messaging began to focus heavily on the player's emotional connection to Lara. In an effort to explain how the reboot differed from previous iterations, executive producer Ron Rosenberg gave an interview to Kotaku in June 2012 that would become the most controversial moment of the entire pre-release cycle so far. Rosenberg stated, "When people play Lara, they don't really project themselves into the character. They're more like, I want to protect her. When you see her have to face these challenges, you start to root for her in a way that you might not root for a male character. This framing, that a female protagonist's appeal lies in her need for protection by the presumed male player, drew immediate and sharp condemnation from cultural critics and industry journalists. Mary Hamilton of The Guardian argued that this was a sexist approach that erased female gamers and relied on paternalistic tropes. She pointed out the double standard. Players are never told they need to protect male heroes like Master Chief or Kratos, regardless of the physical punishment those characters endure. The marketing attempt to foster empathy had backfired, being interpreted instead as disempowerment. The controversy deepened when Rosenberg described a specific scene from the Crossroads trailer where Lara is captured by a male scavenger. In explaining the stakes of the encounter, Rosenberg said, quote, "They try to rape her. She is literally turned into a cornered animal." The use of the word rape to describe a plot point in a mainstream action-adventure game ignited a firestorm. The inclusion of sexual violence, or the threat thereof, was criticized as lazy shorthand for character development, a way to make a female character seem vulnerable without doing the heavy lifting of narrative nuance. The backlash forced the studio into immediate damage control. Crystal Dynamics released a statement clarifying that sexual assault was not a theme of the game, and that the scene in question depicted a life-or-death struggle, not a sexual one. Rhianna Pratchett, the lead writer, became a central figure in this defense.
I sort of was parachuted into the middle of this kind of minor uproar that had happened about the trailer and the things that had been said about Lara and the idea of protecting her and things like that, which hadn't come from me and hadn't come from another narrative person. But it was something that I kind of dealt with and talked about openly and sort of tried to create a discussion about and bring a little bit more clarity as to what was actually in the game and why we put it in there.
A crucible moment of psychological trauma regarding the taking of a life, rather than sexual violation. Pratchett emphasized that Lara's internal monologue during the scene was focused on survival, not victimization. To maintain momentum during the long development cycle, Crystal Dynamics invested in a high production value making-of series titled The Final Hours of Tomb Raider. Produced by industry veteran Jeff Keighley, this campaign was designed to humanize the development team and keep the core fan base engaged. The studio hired actor Zachary Levi, known for the TV series Chuck and the animated film Tangled, to host the documentary series.
Aye.
Levi's involvement was a strategic play for the nerd culture demographic. He conducted interviews with the developers, visited the studio, and provided a fly-on-the-wall perspective on the creative process. The partnership with Levi extended into the game itself. In a move that blurred the lines between marketing and content, Levi was included as a playable character in the game's multiplayer mode. This character, modeled after the actor, was available as a free download for players who engaged with specific promotional activities. While some critics felt this cameo undercut the serious tone of the main game, it served as a unique engagement tool to drive traffic to the multiplayer component. Upon release, Tomb Raider was met with broadly positive critical reception.
Let's get some awards, James.
Though not without important caveats. On Metacritic, the PlayStation 3 version holds a score of 87, placing it firmly in generally favorable territory. The PC and Xbox 360 versions landed in a similar range, with critics largely aligned on what Tomb Raider did well and where it occasionally stumbled. Reviewers overwhelmingly praised the reboot's presentation. Visual fidelity, animation quality, and environmental detail were frequently highlighted as best in class for the time, especially considering the aging PS3 hardware. Crystal Dynamics' depiction of Yamatai, with its rain-soaked forests, rusted shipwrecks, and crumbling ruins, was consistently described as immersive and oppressive in a way that supported the survival narrative. Critics also applauded the reimagining of Lara Croft herself. Many reviews framed the reboot as a necessary cultural course correction, commending the studio for humanizing a character that had long felt more like a mascot than a person. Lara's vulnerability, fear, and gradual competence were often cited as the emotional backbone of the experience. That said, praise was rarely unqualified. The gameplay itself was seen as solid, if occasionally conservative. Combat was described as competent and satisfying, but not particularly innovative. Platforming and traversal received stronger marks, especially when environmental puzzles and vertical exploration were allowed to breathe. The light RPG systems, skill trees, upgrades, and scavenging were generally viewed as additive rather than intrusive. The user scores settled a smidge lower than critical scores at around 8.3. While many players echoed critics' praise, a vocal segment expressed discomfort with the game's tone. Some felt the emphasis on Lara's suffering crossed from humanization into excess, that the constant injuries, grim imagery, and vulnerability bordered on exploitative. Others took issue with the reboot's direction entirely, arguing that it abandoned the puzzle-heavy, globe-trotting identity of classic Tomb Raider in favor of a more cinematic, combat-forward experience inspired by its contemporaries. Another quite vocal subset took issue with the boobs. Smaller were the boobs, and it made some sadness. Yet, even among those detractors, outright rejection was rare. The general consensus, both critical and player-driven, was that this Tomb Raider reboot was a very strong game, even if it wasn't the Tomb Raider everyone wanted. And hindsight being 2020, that may be its greatest achievement. The reboot didn't attempt to please every longtime fan. It made a clear, deliberate statement about what the franchise needed to become in order to survive, and trusted players to either follow along or step aside, and time has largely vindicated that decision. In terms of sales, in its first few weeks, the game sold approximately 3.4 million units worldwide. By historical standards for the franchise, and for most video games, this was a very successful launch. It set a new record for first-week sales in the franchise's history. However, Square Enix immediately shifted the narrative from celebration to crisis. In a fiscal report released shortly after launch, publisher Square Enix labeled the game, along with Hitman Absolution and Sleeping Dogs, as a commercial failure that came nowhere near meeting expectations.
I have failed, my queen.
The publisher had forecast sales of nearly 6 million units in the opening month, which was widely criticized by industry analysts as unattainable. For context, Final Fantasy XIII, a flagship title from Square's most popular brand, had sold around 7 million units in its lifetime. Expecting Tomb Raider to nearly match that within the first month was seen as a sign that the company was out of touch. The game continued to sell robustly throughout the year. By March 2014, the game had surpassed 6 million units sold. More importantly, the game had exceeded profit expectations and had actually achieved profitability by the end of 2013. This effectively debunks the idea that the game remained a financial failure. By 2015, sales reached 8.5 million, and lifetime sales eventually climbed to 14.5 million units, making it the best-selling entry in the entire franchise history.
We're standing on a gold mine!
Since Square Enix wasn't about to take the risk of publishing a sequel to a best-selling game, the future of the series was saved by a timed exclusivity deal with Microsoft. This was not well received by PlayStation gamers, as Sony had historically been the home of Tomb Raider. For PlayStation 3 collectors, Tomb Raider 2013 is about as accessible as it gets, and is available in 3 physical variants. The original 2013 PS3 release is extremely common. Standard complete-in-box copies typically sell for between $10 to $15, with disc-only copies often dipping even lower. Later, Square Enix released a Game of the Year edition for PS3, which is the most complete physical version available on 7th-gen hardware. This edition includes all single-player DLC tombs, multiplayer maps and modes, and additional outfits and weapons. All this content is included on disc, making it the preferred option for preservation-minded collectors. It's roughly the same price as the release version on the secondary market, with sealed copies hovering around $25. Now, if you're looking for a true shelf piece, you'll want to hunt down the official collector's edition. This is back when collector's editions were actually good. In the box is a weathered metal tin from the Endurance, a hardcover mini art book, a physical CD with a 10-track selection from the OST, some DLC codes for weapon packs that are, I assume, no longer valid, a double-sided poster with map, the physical retail game itself, a 5x7 lithograph, 3 iron-on patches, and an 8-inch PlayArts Lara Croft figure. Needless to say, this edition commands a premium. At launch, this retailed for $99.99. On eBay, you're looking at $200 to $300 factory sealed, or $100 to $200 complete, depending on condition. Whichever edition you choose, it's an easy-to-justify purchase and essential for understanding where the franchise and the industry was headed in 2013. In hindsight, Tomb Raider feels less like a reboot and more like a reckoning. Crystal Dynamics' second reboot was an interrogation of the franchise, of Lara Croft herself. They asked what parts of her iconography still mattered, what parts had calcified into parody, and what it would actually mean to earn the confidence that earlier games handed her for free. The result is a game full of contradictions. It wants us to feel Lara's trauma, yet asks us to participate in relentless violence. It frames survival as fragile and costly, yet structures its gameplay around empowerment and mastery. It strives for intimacy while still operating within the machinery of a blockbuster AAA production. But it works, and works well, not because it resolves those tensions, but because it exposes them. Tomb Raider 2013 is fascinating precisely because it's uncomfortable, because it sits at the crossroads between two eras of game design, one rooted in spectacle and power fantasy, the other searching for emotional authenticity and human vulnerability. Lara Croft becomes the vessel for that transition, carrying the weight of an entire industry trying to grow up without fully knowing how. The game doesn't always land its punches gracefully, sometimes it stumbles, it overreaches, it contradicts itself, but it never plays it safe. And that's the part that endures. By stripping Lara of her myth and forcing her to survive, Crystal Dynamics didn't diminish her legacy. They reset it. They gave future games room to breathe, room to evolve, and room to argue with what came before. You don't have to love every choice this reboot made to recognize what it accomplished. It saved the franchise by redefining an icon. And it proved that even legends sometimes need to be broken, just so we can understand why they mattered in the first place.